This episode is a trackpads.com production.
After the opening shock of Cambrai, when British forces had burst through the Hindenburg Line and advanced farther on the first day than many commanders thought possible, the battle began to narrow around a handful of places that seemed small on the map and enormous in reality. Fontaine-notre-Dame and Bourlon Village became two of the most important of those places. They were not the largest objectives in the campaign, and they were not the final prize the public might have imagined when it heard the name Cambrai. Yet by the time the fighting reached them, these villages had become the points where British hopes of turning a breach into a secure and useful position were repeatedly tested and repeatedly drained. What happened there was savage, confused, and costly, and it steadily consumed the offensive energy that had made the first days seem so revolutionary. This podcast is accompanied by a companion book that expands the story of the Battle of Cambrai, with additional historical context, maps, and dozens of enhanced colorized photographs from the battle. Your purchase helps support our mission to keep these podcasts free. You can find the book at militaryauthor.me or at trackpads.com. This happened because the battle had changed its shape. On the 20th of November, surprise, massed tanks, and carefully planned artillery had allowed the British to move with unusual speed across a broad front. By the 21st and 22nd, that broad front momentum had begun to contract. The canal crossings to the east had proven more difficult than hoped. Cavalry exploitation had failed to produce a deeper collapse, and German reserves were beginning to arrive. That left the British holding a salient thrust toward Cambrai, with its northern shoulder overshadowed by Bourlon Ridge and its nearby villages. Under those conditions, Fontaine-notre-Dame and Bourlon Village were no longer just tactical objectives along the route. They became the places that might either secure the salient or leave it dangerously exposed. Each village mattered for slightly different but equally important reasons. Fontaine-Notre-Dame sat on the southern approaches to the ridge, and on the edge of the ground the British needed if they were to protect their position around Cantaing and the rising land toward Bourlon. Bourlon Village, meanwhile, lay alongside the wood and close to the crest of the ridge itself, making it part of the commanding ground from which the Germans could observe and contest the entire British hold on the northern side of the salient. A village in this kind of battle was never just a cluster of houses. It was streets that could channel movement, cellars that could shelter defenders, walls that could break up infantry attacks, and road junctions that could decide where artillery, ammunition, and reinforcements might pass. Taken together, Fontaine and Bourlon Village formed the kind of local battle zone that could decide whether the larger offensive still had a future. The first warning came on the 21st of November. British troops, helped by tanks and supported by the progress made around Anu and Cantaing, pushed toward Fontaine-Notre-Dame and the approaches to Bourlon. For a time, it seemed as if the villages might fall in the same rolling fashion that had carried the opening day forward. Anu was completed. Cantaing was seized, and British troops reached the outskirts of Bourlon Wood, while Fontaine-Notre-Dame was taken late in the day. But even here, the warning signs were plain. Fire from the ridge and the wood had already slowed the attack, and the British did not secure the whole position in a way that would let them build on success smoothly. Soon enough, the Germans regained Fontaine, And that quick reversal showed how unstable these gains really were once surprise had faded. By the 23rd of November, the British had decided to renew the effort with greater weight. The 41st? No, the main burden now fell on the 40th Division for Bourlon and on the 51st Division for Fontaine-notre-Dame, with tanks once again brought up to help force the issue. The assault itself was difficult even before it reached the enemy. Men had to move over ground already churned by traffic and shell fire, descend and climb under observation, and advance from a sunken lane toward positions the Germans had had time to strengthen. In the case of Fontaine, the first morning attack could not force an entrance. Later in the day, the assault was tried again from the west, and tanks did manage to enter the village, remaining there until dusk and inflicting real damage. Even so, the British could not clear Fontaine completely, and by evening the line in that sector had not truly advanced. At the same time, the assault on Bourlon Wood and Bourlon Village became one of the hardest local fights of the whole campaign. The 40th Division attacked through mist with tank support, and after hours of bitter fighting, its men pushed through the wood and entered the village. On paper, that sounds like success, and in one sense it was. British troops had forced their way onto some of the most important ground on the battlefield. But success there was immediately unstable. German counterattacks struck before the British could consolidate. Reports became confused, and a village said at one moment to be in British hands could not be held as securely as first believed. This is the cruel reality of local battle in a contested zone. Entry is not possession, and possession is not security. The nature of the fighting explains why these places swallowed so much effort. In open country, tanks, creeping barrage, and infantry could still be synchronized with some clarity. In the ruined streets of Fontaine and in the village edge fighting near Bourlon, that system began to break apart. Tanks could help batter into strong points or overawe defenders for a moment, but streets, rubble, walls, and close-range fire reduced many of their advantages. Infantry had to clear houses, corners, courtyards, and cellars in short-range combat, where the broader operational design of the battle counted for less than local nerve and immediate support. Artillery remained decisive, but here it was less a clean opening instrument than a constant hammer, smashing the approaches, bursting through buildings, and turning every attempt to organize inside a captured street into a fresh risk. The battle became intimate in the worst possible way. That is why these villages consumed manpower so quickly. Units sent in to attack were not simply fighting one decisive action and moving on. They were entering a cycle of partial success, counterattack, renewed assault, and local collapse. At Bourlon Wood and Bourlon Village, battalions were pushed forward, cut up, and then asked to hold exposed edges of woodland or village streets against German replies that came again and again. At Fontaine-notre-Dame, the problem was similar. Tanks could get in, infantry could get in, but holding the place under concentrated fire and against determined defenders proved vastly harder than reaching it. The result was not a clean victory or a clean failure. It was attrition, the kind in which every yard gained demanded new men, new ammunition, new tanks, and new courage just to keep the previous hour's success from evaporating. The Germans understood exactly what these places were worth, and they fought accordingly. They did not need to recover the whole battlefield at once. They only needed to deny the British a secure hold on the villages that anchored the ridge position. That meant rapid counterattacks, concentrated artillery, and stubborn local defense. On the 24th of November, British forces again fought for Bourlon Village and at one point captured the whole place, while heavy attacks were also beaten off in the wood. Yet the struggle did not settle. By the evening of the 25th, the Germans had regained Bourlon Village, and although small British parties held out in parts of it, the larger tactical gain was gone again. This is one of the clearest signs that the offensive was being eaten alive. The same ground had to be paid for repeatedly, and still it would not stay bought. All of this placed a terrible strain on the formations involved. The 40th Division, which had borne much of the burden around Bourlon, was worn down so heavily that it eventually had to be withdrawn. That fact tells its own story. These were not decorative attacks launched with spare troops after a successful breakthrough. These were the central efforts of the later battle, and they were using up the very divisions that still had to hold the salient once the attack ran out of force. Roads behind the front were breaking down under constant traffic. Reliefs took too long. Tanks were fewer and less effective in this terrain than on the opening day, and weather only made conditions worse. By now, the battle was no longer feeding momentum. It was feeding the front line itself, just enough to keep the struggle alive without delivering a decisive result. The final major British effort on the 27th of November made the pattern unmistakable. It was decided to try once more to seize Fontaine-notre-Dame and Bourlon Village, and, by doing so, gain the whole of Bourlon Ridge. This was not done because commanders were blind to the cost. It was done because without those villages, the ridge position remained insecure, and much of the ground south of the wood stayed exposed to enemy observation and fire. The Guards temporarily regained Fontaine-Notre-Dame, and troops of the 62nd Division entered Bourlon Village once more. For a brief moment, it seemed possible that persistence might finally secure what brilliance on the first day had not. Then heavy German counterattacks developed in both places, and once again the British were unable to keep the ground they had just won. At that point, the essential truth of these local battles could no longer be avoided. Fontaine and Bourlon Village were not merely hard objectives delaying a still-living offensive. They had become the mechanism by which the offensive was being spent. Every renewed assault demanded more infantry, more tank support, more artillery, and more time, while the Germans gained exactly what they needed from the repeated struggle: time to reinforce, time to reorganize, and time to prepare the larger response that would come at the end of the month. The British still held parts of Bourlon Wood and some valuable ground, but not all the tactical points required to make the position comfortable or secure. A campaign that had begun by seeming to break the old rules of the Western Front was now being consumed in a familiar way, through repeated local battles that bled energy faster than they created opportunity. There is a larger lesson here about armored warfare and about battle more generally. The opening success at Cambrai showed how tanks, artillery science, and infantry coordination could rupture a fortified front. Fontaine-Notre-Dame and Bourlon Village showed what happened after rupture, when the fight passed into built-up ground, under enemy observation, and against defenders who had recovered their balance. New methods had changed the beginning of the battle, but they had not abolished the old truths of close combat. Villages still had to be cleared by infantry. Ruins still broke up command and movement. Artillery still made holding ground as dangerous as taking it. And once the conquest became local enough, the battlefield again rewarded the side that could keep feeding organized resistance into a few crucial points faster than the attacker could secure them. So the savage fighting at Fontaine and Bourlon Village deserves to be remembered not as a side note to Cambrai's more famous opening, but as the phase that revealed the battle's final limits. These villages ate up the offensive because they lay exactly where tactical necessity, terrain, and German recovery all converged. The British could reach them, enter them, damage them, and sometimes even hold them briefly. But doing so over and over again turned a battle of movement into a battle of consumption. By the time the fighting there had run its course, the offensive force that had burst through the Hindenburg Line was no longer the same force. It had been worn down in streets, cellars, wood edges, and shattered approaches, until the remaining gains, however real, no longer promised decisive expansion. That is how local battles can swallow grand plans. Not in one dramatic failure, but in repeated success that costs too much to keep.
You've been listening to Famous Tank Battles. These battles were never just about machines. They were about doctrine, terrain, firepower, logistics, and the hard problem of turning shock into victory. For more military history writing and books, visit militaryauthor.me. And for magazines, podcasts, and a massive archive of military photos and video, visit trackpads.com. Thanks for listening.